I'm working together very closely with an incredible group of people, at the center in terms of kind of the great intellectual spiritual project of the center. Zach Stein, Dr. Christina Kincaid, Ken Wilber, Kirsten Zohar, Claire Molinaire, Dr. Elena Maslova-Levine, Krista, of course, Christina Amelon, incredible work. And down the list, right? Simona, Stephanie, kind of the entrepreneurial kind of, business leadership, and Shot, who's been, in the leadership of communities for, oh my God, right, 30 years. The group of both men and women, right, and their depth, who kind of are together in the leadership of the center, right, are a group of people who are so intensely good, right, intensely kind, intensely sensitive, intensely just, just, you know, um, just an incredible group of people. So, I kind of, the first thing I want to say is I'm just so privileged to be here with everybody, right? I'm so privileged to be here with everyone. It's such an intense and insane honor, right, to be in this group. And of course, Barbara Marx Hubbard, right, her great desire was for the center to have the continuity that it has in such a beautiful way. And, and then I think of Sally Kempton, the depth and beauty of Sally Kempton's work as a great teacher of Kashmir Shaivism. And I just feel surrounded by, Shakti, by the true divine feminine. It's very easy to take the divine feminine as a name in vain. One of the things that Sally Kempton used to kind of be very sad about is people hijacking the divine feminine, right? And there's actually a beautiful commandment in the sacred text: thou shalt not take God's name in vain. So the amount of kind of hijacking of Kali, or the divine feminine, as opposed to really living and being the divine feminine, which requires something, and it requires a depth, and it's not a slogan, it's not a veneer, right? That's where true Tantra lives, right? It's true Tantra is the deep, Tantra has three principles, Tantra, right? In other words, and it's very, very deep. And you can be a teacher of Tantra, you can be a scholar of Tantra and not live the Tantric way, right? But the Tantric way is first the principle of non-rejection. Nothing's off the table, right? It's like, the principle of non-rejection. That's the first major Tantric principle, which is so wildly important. Nothing's off the table. We don't make the easy distinction between sacred and profane, between light and darkness, between conventional and post-conventional. Does that make sense, everyone? Yeah, that's the first principle of Tantra. And it's the first principle, I would say, of the center, right? Is a Tantric principle, the principle of non-rejection, right? So for example, I mentioned Dr. Kincaid earlier. Her principle is, right, don't reject your agency. Don't reject your power. Don't reject your capacity to choose, right? Don't self-infantilize. It's big. Does everyone get that? Right? So just kind of claiming and owning our power. Who can feel that one? Right? We don't reject our power. Right? One of the tragic moves of false self-victimization is I was powerless. Right? And that's the false self-victimizer. And we live today in this kind of culture of victimhood, right, which is the name of an article. Or there's another book by David Sykes called A Nation of Victims. And the move of the victim is, I'm innocent. They did it to me. I had no power. So what the victim does is they kind of, first off, they cast the other person in a dynamic, right, as a predator, right, a victimizer. Then they cast themselves as victims, right? Fact patterns don't matter. Truth disappears, right? I was somehow a victim, right? My own agency, my own power is rejected. It's taken off the table. It's split off, right? How do you do that? So what you do is you hyperbolize this enormous power to the person I'm in contact with. So I'll just share with you, because you should always make these things personal. I've been called Palpatine. That's the emperor. Right? I know it's a little funny, but it's in the Sith Lord Emperor, right? Right. Wow. He's Palpatine. Like, whoa. So the joke that KK and I have is I call KK Palpatina, because like what you have nothing to say to that kind of absurdity. Right. But, so whenever we have a kind of, powerful potent, alive, filled with life, filled with delight, sharing, and we feel like, wow, that's really sweeping me. We can do that in a way which is, oh, I lost my power, right? Right? No, I'm being swept away by Palpatine, right? And by the way, just to say, I've been at this for a few decades, but since internet comment threads have started, I'm kind of with, Jimmy Kimmel and Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama wrote that if her and Barack had ever looked at the comment threads on social media, their marriage never would have survived, because the level of viciousness that exists in that kind of culture is kind of unimaginable. Jimmy Kimmel, talks about just the unimaginable pain, right, he experiences when he looks at comment threads, and just the viciousness with which people depict him, right? So I've experienced that myself. It's like people split off their power, and then they, instead of integrating the complex, they demonize, right? So Jimmy Kimmel becomes, this kind of mad demon. So just because I want to make it personal, I don't want to talk about other people. So I've been called Palpatine. I mean, I know this is hard, but Charles Manson, like, how could that even be? So you're like, wow, like, whoa, hello, hello, right, hello. And it's just, and by the way, I'm extremely sensitive, so I have never learned the capacity to not be surprised by evil. One of my key friends, colleagues, I would even call him a teacher, said to me, I don't know, a decade ago, he said, Mark, doing what you're doing, you don't have a right to be surprised by evil. I'm always surprised by evil. I'm like, wow, right? And it has a quality. There's a certain, you don't even have to, there's a certain quality. There's a fabric. There's a way that evil feels, right? Right. And so it comes from this non-tantric capacity, right? Tantra is not a blurring of appropriate boundary. Boundary is real. Ethics are real, right? Of course they are. They're totally real. And, right, where we place, right, how we draw our boundaries, right, actually is both universal and very specific. It's very individual. It's very about the depth of this specific moment in this specific situation. I'll just give you an example. I'm against affairs, right? I think in general people shouldn't have affairs, right? Right. I think that's generally true. And then Esther Perel, right, wrote a book called The State of Affairs. And Esther Perel is also pretty much against affairs. But what she points out is that sometimes when a person has an affair, it's not because they're betraying their partner. It's because they feel like if they don't act out in some level of aliveness, they'll actually die. They'll betray their own aliveness. Now, that doesn't justify the affair. I want to be quite clear about that. It just means it's more complex. So Esther Perel just wrote this book, which is, I would call it a tantric book, called The State of Affairs, in which she complexifies, right, that moment. Not endorsing it, of course not, right? But just saying, oh, it's a little more complex. We think in an affair, for example, that the person that had the affair is the demon, and the person who's been quote unquote betrayed is the victim. And what Perel points out is it's often a far more complex situation. So I would call that book A State of Affairs by Esther Perel, which has become a major mainstream book, all over culture. And her earlier book, which is called Mating in Captivity, which deals with some of the similar territory, I would call that a tantric book. Does that make sense to everyone? Right? And it's a tantric book means the first principle of Tantra is the principle of non-rejection. So demonization is non-tantric. Is everyone getting this? I don't know. It's in my heart. So I want to just, if I can share it with you, and it's why I'm proud of the center. That's actually why I started. I started with just being proud of the leadership of the center, and God, we've been together, many of us, for 15 years, and others for 5 years or 4 years or 10 years or 7 years. It's just like, I'm so proud of everyone. I could actually cry, right? I'm just so proud of everyone. So I wanted to kind of share that the center at its very core is what I would call tantric. But by tantric, I mean, tantric is not about sexuality. 99% of tantric texts have nothing to do with sexuality. It's about how I hold myself in the world. So the first principle of tantra is nothing's off the table. I don't hide things, right? Whose context is critical. I don't hide them from myself. That's the biggest thing. It's what do I hide from myself? Even ordinary people are geniuses at self-deception. What do I hide from myself? I need everything on the table. It's deep. It's so the first tantric principle. When I say the first tantric principle, I'm not talking about in a particular Kashmir Shaivite or Hebrew wisdom tradition. I've spent, probably 40 years deep in kind of tantric practice and studying tantric traditions. And by tantra, I mean a quality of consciousness, a quality of thought, a quality of practice that lives in every great tradition. It's in mystical Christianity, it's in the African traditions, it's in the indigenous traditions, it's in certain top parts of Sufism. So the first principle is the principle of non-rejection. And so the example I gave for non-rejection, the opposite of non-rejection is demonization. Now, again, I want to be clearly, I want to stay with me closely. That doesn't mean that Hitler's not a demon. Hitler was a demon, right? Clearly, because there are demons. But demonization means, to stay really close, demonization means where I apply demonology where it doesn't belong, right? So when Jimmy Kimmel talks about the way he's demonized, when Barack Obama is demonized as this vicious, demonic, evil figure, right? Regularly, Barack Obama is demonized as this kind of Weedico, demonic evil figure, in tens of thousands, right? Of tens and tens of thousands of comment threads all across America. It's like a given as this manipulative, vicious, kind of horrific, evil figure, utter demonization. So that kind of demonization, when we apply it without enormous rigor, when we call people Charles Manson, whoa, we're probably projecting some deep evil in ourselves, right? That's generally when people project that kind of evil, it's probably because they feel something very dark in themselves and they're projecting it. So Tantra is the principle of non-rejection. And the first non-rejection is don't reject parts of myself. Because if I reject parts of myself, I'm going to demonize you. I'm going to project it onto you. Right? Right? Stalkers. Right? Sometimes a person will kind of like obsess over an issue. They'll look like they're standing for justice, but they're actually just being a 20-year stalker or a 30-year stalker. And they're actually, it looks like they're reporting on things happening, but actually they're behind the scenes arousing the things and causing them to happen all the time in order to have an object, right, of focus where they can kind of pour their hatred or their anger, right, or their confusion, right, and they label, right, whoever they're stalking or whatever they're stalking as evil because they've actually can't find the tantric place where they can find the complexity in themselves. They can find the shadow in themselves. If I can't find the shadow in myself, I project it onto you. So the first principle of Tantra is the principle of non-rejection. I don't reject and split off parts of myself. And I don't demonize, right? Unless it's, unless we are talking about Charles Manson, right? Right. But in other words, generally it's not, it shouldn't be part of our conversation. And often we have what Scott Peck in a book in the 90s, he wrote a book called People of the Lie, which is actually, he talks about ordinary people. He's not talking about kind of teachers or politicians. No, just ordinary people living their lives, where he calls them people of the lie. And the lie is they can't bear to be displeasing to themselves. I was talking to a close dear friend of mine yesterday who just blew me away with her depth and integrity, right? And, I shared with her a citation from a great Christian saint, a great woman, a great, incarnator of the divine feminine. She writes, if you cannot bear to be displeasing to yourself, if you cannot bear to be displeasing to yourself, you will not be a sweet shelter for Jesus. Isn't that beautiful? If you cannot bear to be displeasing to yourself, you will never be a sweet shelter. Yes, thank you. You'll never be a sweet shelter for Jesus. And it's such a beautiful realization. That's the principle of non-rejection. First tantric principle is don't split off parts of yourself, because if you do, you're going to project them onto other people. Right? And so that's really, really important. And so I was talking about in terms of, KK's teaching, the victim splits off their own power. So sometimes I'll split off my shadow and project it onto you. Sometimes I'll split off my own power and then project it onto someone. Someone else has this enormous power over me. That's not quite true. Power is actually distributed in complex ways in relationships. There's a play that just came to, where I live here. And this play is called, it just came to the local little theater. And the play is called Oleana by David Mamet, Mamet. I hope I'm not mispronouncing his name. And Oleana is one of the early plays written about sexual harassment. And it's about how a woman, essentially makes false complaints about her teacher and brings him down, right? Really kind of goes to destroy him in a very, very horrific and vicious way. And it looks like she's the victim. And he's this, all-powerful professor. And of course, that's not the case at all. And this is something that Laura Kipnis has written about extensively, kind of, the false complaints, for example, of sexual harassment. So just like we have the horror of sexual harassment, the horror of sexual abuse, and Dr. Kincaid is making a beautiful movie about healing from sexual abuse. And one of the major issues of the center is helping people recover voice who have been sexually abused. But a person can also hijack that issue and abuse sexuality by making false claims of sexual abuse, false claims of sexual harassment. That's what David Mamet, the great liberal writer, that's what his play Oleana is about. So it comes from a splitting off of my own power. Does that make sense? I can't own my own power. Since I can't own my own power, I have no power, right? I project it onto you, right? So you're all powerful, right? I have no power, right? That's almost never the case. Power is distributed in very complex ways between people, and much more is possible, right? If we actually own the mutuality of our power, right? And power is not evil. Power is godly, right? We relate to God not just as we call God the infinite intimate in cosmologic humanism. But before cosmologic humanism, you had all the classical great traditions which talked about God as the infinity of power. So power is not abusive. The abuse of power is abusive. So the first tantric principle is the principle of non-rejection, right? I don't reject part of myself. I don't demonize, unless we're talking about Hitler or Charles Manson or Palpatine for real, right? But we don't throw that kind of stuff around, because if we do, we're probably projecting something, which probably comes from splitting off something very dark in myself. So that's the first principle. Now, the way to avoid, just one more word on this first principle, the way to avoid the demon is the daimon. Does that make sense? The way to avoid the demon is the daimon. And the daimon means I actually have a true sense of my unique self. I'm actually, wow. I got like, wow, right? Once in a while, and a true sense of my unique self might be a true sense of, my daimon, which means my calling, the, Aristotle, the entelechy of my life. I have a sense of my purpose and direction. And my purpose and direction is both I'm at home in myself, I'm welcome in the universe, and I'm at home in my relationships. My relationships, a dear friend of mine just mentioned that they just were having a big dinner with, 3 of their children, with all of their partners, and, gathered around the table. Well, that's being at home. That's beautiful. Another friend of mine, just, colleague, student, just mentioned, wow, I just had a beautiful dinner with my mother, and we've come so far in the depth of our relationship. And another friend said to me, friend, colleague, student, said a few weeks ago, we were talking in Holy of Holies, and she was talking about how deep, in the last couple of years, we had kind of challenged certain assumptions about her relationship to her husband and how much closer they've come. We were like 50 of us just gathered a few weeks ago here, the sense of being at home together. So when I'm not at home, I'm not in my daimon. My daimon means I'm at home in the world. I'm at home in my relationships. They might be imperfect, but I'm at home. But when I feel like, I'm not really at home, I made the wrong choice, I can't find my aliveness, right? I'm bitter, right? I haven't really fulfilled, right, what I could have done. I've never really been on the line. I haven't lived my story, right? And it's not about public accolade. It's about something very, very deep. There's something very deep and hidden and broken in me, right? Then, right, I haven't embraced myself. And to embrace myself, it's not self-acceptance exactly. It's integration. right? I own that which is displeasing. I own that which is broken. I own my broken heart, and I realize there's nothing more whole than a broken heart. And I experience my own wholeness, which includes my broken heart. So I don't need to go break hearts or to go try and hurt in order to feel alive. Often a person who attacks, right, who hasn't experienced the principle of, of non-rejection. They've split off parts of themselves, right? They've split off their own aliveness. That they can't actually feel their own aliveness. So they can only feel their own aliveness by attacking someone else. Does that make sense? That's sometimes true about a nation collectively, right? Mother Russia becomes Mother Russia by attacking Ukraine. Really? Right? With a viciousness that's unimaginable. Right? And as I only become who I am through, I actually have an experience of my own aliveness, my own Eros. Eros is being in the circle, being welcome in the circle. I only experience my own Eros by splitting someone else and putting themselves outside the circle. But not only do I put them outside the circle, right? I try and hurt them as badly as I can. And when I feel like I've hurt them sadistically, I become alive. That's the sadist. The sadist is not pseudo-eros. The sadist is anti-eros. Right? The sadist becomes alive through inflicting pain, alienation. So eros is the experience of radical aliveness, desiring ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness. That's the eros equation. We live in a world in which is animated by eros value. But eros value, eros has its opposite, right? And its opposite is, it's not a full opposite, because in the end, everything's included in eros value. But in the nature of the world, there's an ostensible opposite. There's an ostensible counter to eros, which is not pseudo-eros. Pseudo-eros is pseudo-aliveness. Does that make sense? I can't experience my aliveness. I don't experience contact, so I want pseudo-aliveness. So that would be addiction, might be pseudo-aliveness, right? Right? I might be a workaholic to have pseudo-aliveness, right? To kind of have this pseudo-experience of making contact and being whole. But anti-eros is, I don't want to make contact. I want to create alienation. I don't want to create wholeness. I want to fragment. I don't want to give depth of pleasure. I want to cause pain. And I become alive through the causing of pain. I don't actually feel alive unless I'm causing pain. Now, of course, let me be clear. No one can admit that. That would be, in order to admit that, I'd have to be displeasing to myself. If I was displeasing to myself, I would realize it and I would transform it. I wouldn't do it, because everyone has a devil that lives inside of them. Everyone's a devil and divine. Everyone's an angel and an animal. But that's the nature of the human being. So I need to basically embrace, see clearly, oh, that's what's at play in me, and transform it. That's so deep. Does everyone get that? So deep. That's so deep. That's so deep. Why did Moses become the great leader that he was, right? In the great kind of Genesis text. So Moses becomes a great leader. So there's a text, a very beautiful text by one master, who says that an artist came to kind of paint Moses. So there's this kind of enemy who paints Moses, right? In the hidden tradition, and they capture him, and then they bring a picture of the painting, the drawing of Moses, and they paint Moses, and Moses looks like a murderer. Oof. So they want to put to death this, enemy, from one of the Canaanite tribes, who's painted Moses and depicted their noble and kind leader as a murderer. And Moses says, stop. I don't think he said it in Yiddish, but he said stop in whatever dialect of Hebrew he was speaking. And he said, no, he's accurate. That's accurate. They said, what do you mean you're a murderer? You're the most kind person we know. He said, no, I found the rage in me, and I traced it back so deep inside, and then I transformed it into this, this outrageous kindness, right? So rage becomes outrageous. It's not just, right? Not just lots of love. We want outrageous love, right? I had a historical, funny exchange with my dear friend John Mackey many times. Back in the day, we were talking about this thing we call outrageous love. We live in a world of outrageous pain. The only response is outrageous love is one of the core kind of structures of the way we live, right? And John said, well, call it unlimited love, not outrageous, right? Outrageous has the word rage. But the answer is yes, it does have the word rage, because I actually have to go. Moses said, I was filled with the rage of a murderer, and I had to go to that rage and transform it into outrageous kindness, outrageous love. You notice that the word courage, core is love, and then rage. So the word courage means outrageous love. Does everyone get that? Core, love, rage. Love that comes from this raging love. We're only going to address the meta crisis through raging love, through outrageous love. But I got to do that through the principle of non-rejection. Moses doesn't reject that murderous rage in him. Nietzsche says, I don't trust people who can't own their murderous rage and transform it. It's a famous, important line by Nietzsche in Zarathustra, thus spake. All right, it's a critical idea that Nietzsche understood well. So that's the tantric principle of non-rejection. Does that make sense, everyone? It's so deep, right? So I've got to actually, if I can actually practice the principle of non-rejection, I can actually own that displeasing part of myself, and then I transform it into that which offers the greatest pleasure into reality. But when I don't do that, I demonize. And it gets, I want to say, I've experienced being demonized over decades. You know, I'm privileged with the most insane group of friends and colleagues and students and partners, just dozens and dozens of unimaginably good people. So I'm blessed every day, and I'm ecstatic to be here. But I've experienced demonization. I know what it's about, and there's a quality to it. You can feel the quality, and it's the quality. It's called in the liturgy, you know, Sitra Achra, the other side, and it's non-tantric at its very core. Right? Tantra is not about a particular form of Kashmir Shaivism from Abhinavagupta, and 1,300 years ago. We need a contemporary Tantra, which weaves all the strains of Tantra and all the best of all the great forms of wisdom into a new tantric story, right? And that story is non-rejection.
If you're enjoying this teaching with Dr. Marc Gafni, then we have two amazing opportunities for you. Number one, we host these live teachings every single Sunday, and you can join for free by signing up for our free tier of our online educational community called Who We Must Become. The link is in the description. Number two, if you want to dive into deeper levels of these teachings and become a student at the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, then you can join the paid tier of our online educational community. By joining, you will get instant access to thousands of dollars worth of courses with Dr. Marc Gafni, as well as bi-weekly book club meetings to read, learn, and discuss, and much more. There's also a 7-day free trial, so click the link in the description and join risk-free today. Now, back to the teaching with Dr. Marc Gafni.
How can you tell if a person is tantric? So there's only one simple way to actually identify tantric. Okay, how do I know if a person's tantric? They're willing to have a conversation. Right? Polarization is non-tantric. Does that make sense? Polarization, I've demonized you. I'm not going to have a conversation. And I'm usually going to demonize you because I did something that was betraying. All right, I somehow became Judas. I somehow betrayed. And by Judas, I don't mean, I mean that as a literary metaphor. I somehow betrayed. I can't own my own betrayal. So I find something that either I say you did wrong or you did do wrong. Maybe you did, right? Often we do things wrong. We make mistakes. But instead of talking to you about it, I demonize you. I refuse to have a conversation, right? And then what I do is, like demonizers always do, I amplify, I distort, I exaggerate, and then I deny. I deny the deeper context, the deeper goodness, the deeper love, the deeper eros, the deeper integrity, the deeper kindness, right? If thousands of conversations disappear, I demonize. So that's a big deal. Polarization means there's no conversation. Potency, power, means I can have a conversation. Now, the reason people don't have conversations is because, wow, it's too painful. Why is it too painful? Because I won't be able to own my own power, or because, and what we do is we then paint the other person, I don't know, I'll just use this image, as Palpatine, right? As, right, they have, occult powers, I can't talk to them. Whoa, relax, stop infantilizing. Have a conversation, have a mediated conversation. Great, make yourself safe. If you don't feel safe, make yourself safe, right? We all everyone likes to talk about how they're unsafe. The big thing in the world today is I'm unsafe. I mean, as Laura Kipnis says, maybe sometimes we should, within the context of a broad, deep safety, maybe we need to get a little unsafe, meaning to stretch our boundaries. There's a holy safety, and then there's a kind of safety which is about comfort and refusing and avoiding the actually edges of reality where we actually find each other. But putting all that aside, the demarcating characteristic of an anti-tantric position is I won't have a conversation. I'll demonize, I'll lash out, and that's the nature of common threads. The culture of common threads that Jimmy Kimmel and Michelle Obama are referring to, right, is that kind of horrific demonization. You know, my dear friend Aubrey Marcus just did a podcast that I participated in. And for the first time ever, Aubrey had to delete the common threads. So he wrote in his public post. And I read some of the common threads. And I just want to tell you, I literally had to go and immerse myself in just, chanting and, take a long, cold, hot shower, immerse myself in that kind of symbolic ritual bath of purity, because literally you came out like degraded, people cursing, but cursing not like blank you cursing, but just a vile, vicious energy saying, Aubrey, you should never have children, and words like sinister, and it got much, much worse. I don't even want to evoke the energy. But the common thread was so violent, right? And in the end, it was, a podcast which you may have agreed with or disagreed with, you may have liked or not liked, but it was basically about a person who, wanted to live honestly and, wanted to kind of create a new configuration of intimacy, had a huge commitment, him and his wife, not to have any affairs, to be fully honest with each other. They wanted to have another beloved in their relationship, and they were trying to work it out. That's the whole thing, with full honesty, full integrity, full beauty, right? And, for whatever reason, whatever that tapped into, my point is not to talk about that podcast. That's not our issue here in One Mountain. My point is I just happened to read that comment thread recently, and oh my God, right? And of course, then I think there must have been 50 podcasts made about that podcast, right? Because people were then trying to attract attention. Let's use this turbocharged algorithm to make a podcast where I can now attract attention to myself and engage in more demonization. Like, whoa, slow down, everybody. Slow down, right? We have to be willing to have conversations. Common threads are either pseudo-eros or anti-eros. They're not conversations. Conversations is where we hold each other. We sit face to face, or again, or in mediated context. We examine information. We look for the good in each other. We search for the daimon, not the demon. We realize that actually we're willing to be displeasing to ourselves. We're willing to transform. We're willing to grow. We're willing to deepen. We're willing to become more. The Tantric principle is the principle of non-rejection. It's so deep. It's so deep. It's so deep. Right? So find, I say to you, I say to me, what am I rejecting? What am I splitting off? There's a very beautiful statement in the lineage, which we say in morning prayer, which is L'shem yichud kudshabrichu shechinte, for the sake of uniting that which is split off, right? Bringing together the true divine feminine with the true divine masculine. Is L'shem yichud, is healing the split off parts, creating a conversation, right? My dear friend, Professor Schwartz, right, who created internal family systems. I haven't talked to Dick in a while, maybe a year ago, but he's done fantastic work in internal family systems. We did a bunch of dialogues that are up on the web, and he did very, very close work with one of our dear colleagues, Lori Galperin, and he's just a beautiful job in internal family systems, and he's created a beautiful world of IFS therapists. And one of the things that's beautiful in IFS is it's about having a conversation. It's the parts of us that are not conversing with each other, right? So I would say internal family systems, like Esther Perel's book, State of Affairs, internal family systems is a tantric psychology in the sense that, right? That it says, oh, you've got these split off voices, bring them into conversation, right? All the voices, all my sub-personalities, all my voices need to be at the table. And then I can't actually say, oh, right, I did this terrible thing to you because my sub-personality did it. No. That's the other side. That's sitra achar. That's the split off side. Right? That's anti-tantric. And when a person said, wow, I heard those voices and they caused me to do this, or it was my, it was my protector acting up that moved to kill you. It was my wounded child. No. That's non-tantric. The point of tantra is actually to expand. Tan means to expand, and tan means to weave. So I expand, I bring in all the voices, I weave them together into a voice for which I take responsibility. That's Dr. Kincaid's point, right? Dr. Kincaid's point is you can't infantilize and say it was that voice. No, own your voice, bring the voices together, integrate the voices, make those voices whole, right? Make your voice a note in the Unique Self Symphony, which is playing music that is actually arouses she. L'shem yichud, we bring together the split off parts. We have a conversation. One of the things that I'm proudest about, at the center is the depth of conversation. I am madly committed to conversation. And with the people that have, that I've been partnering with longest, we've had the most conversation. And in conversation, we can agree and we can disagree. And if you would ask me kind of one good point about me is actually take feedback. I like feedback. But the fact that you give feedback doesn't mean you're right. Let's talk about it. Let's argue about it. Let's go back and forth. Let's listen to each other. Let's impact each other. Right? Let's come out more whole. You can't just declare something. But when people give like really feedback, which comes from the heart, like, wow, and someone can show me something I can't see, I'm ecstatic. But not because you said it. No. Take deep responsibility. Not just you had to feel like deep responsibility, but responsible feedback from a person who loves you madly, who wants your goodness and wants your emergence, and who's standing shoulder to shoulder with you is beautiful. And one of the things that, myself and Zach and Kathy and KK and Kirsten and Jacqueline and, right, all of us, right, Suzette, right, Claire, right, all of us together, right, hold Christine Amelon, right, we hold this, we have wonderful conversations, right? The center is built on wonderful conversations. It's tantric. It's dozens of people, over many, many years. And of course, not everyone makes it. And people, of course, like, in any community can come and go, and they can come and go legitimately. And people should come in peace and go in peace, of course, right? Only in a pre-personal cult, you're not allowed to leave, right? So, but even when we go, the question is, how do we go? Do we go in the depth of conversation? Do we go having had a real conversation and talk to each other and created wholeness? That's always what it's about. It's conversation. So that's prayer. Prayer is I said we're going to talk about prayer is the conversation between the human being and the infinite intimate. Prophecy is the conversation between the infinite intimate and the human being. In prayer, we initiate and we invoke the conversation. In prophecy, God initiates and God invokes. Wow. So that's the first principle of Tantra. The first principle of Tantra is, and it's so beautiful and it's so important, is this principle of non-rejection. Is that helpful? There's 3 other principles of Tantra. I'm going to stop here, but I just want to check in with the chat box. I want to check in with everyone, right? It's powerful, right? It's deep. Maybe next week, but I want to do a little vote with everyone together. I would like to next week perhaps do the next 3, right? We'll finish all 3. All 3. Well, there's 4 major principles of kind of Tantra as a kind of structure that I've put together, together with Zach and colleagues in Cosmoerotic Humanism. So we just talked about the first principle of Tantra. It's deep, right? Does everyone get how deep it is? It's like deep. It's deep, right? It's deep. I want to end with a prayer like I promised I would. I know we didn't get to reincarnation. Eli, don't be too mad at me, right? I didn't do the topic for this week, so we're going to delay that. And I want to just also, this is not exactly an apology; it's a half apology. We're gonna reboot the whole One Mountain system in September to its next level. But one of the things I'm wrestling with, and we could all think about it together, is Eli and Krista and KK, KK's been a major proponent of kind of formalizing, and the kind of one mountain to the next level. And KK is also a huge, like I'd say, the biggest fan of One Mountain now. Like we love One Mountain. I think we all do. But one of the things is what Eli said to me, could we like have a topic before? So we have a topic before, and then then I don't talk about the topic that we have. So first of all, I just want to apologize for that, right? But I also want to say a second thing is I can't read a script. I can only talk to you about what's on my heart. So I'm insanely excited to talk to you about reincarnation. I've got an entire set of notes I came with, to talk to you about reincarnation today. And I had a particular order and set of things I wanted to do. But sometimes what happens is that she, right, she hijacks the conversation. And so this is one of those days. Does everyone get what I mean when I say she hijacks the conversation? And who gets what I mean when I say that? I'm not invoking some strange occult powers. I'm saying she steps in, and there's something that emerges, and there's so few places in culture where we can actually touch authenticity, where someone's not reading a script to you, where we can feel each other's heart, we can touch each other, we can talk and have this conversation. And in our chat box, I'm actually watching the chat box all the time, and we can feel each other. And we have many, many contexts, right, within the Center for Conversation. Here, in One Mountain, it's not a conversation in the classical sense. I share every week, and we have a Dharma recapitulation, we have chant. But we have many contexts of deep conversation, and we keep the chat box open. I used to, my friend Andrew Cohen, who passed away, who had such an ecstatic and painful and tumultuous life, and who endured so much pain and also brought so many people clarity. He had a very, very complex and painful life, and was madly dedicated to liberation. And he's written a book about his own story, and other people have written about it. But Andrew and I used to, I don't know how many of you remember, Andrew and I did how many, Krista, like 15 dialogues, right? And we would argue before about whether we should leave the chat box on. And Andrew, of course, wanted the chat box off, which I understand, because he's trying to give a transmission. And we do a strange thing here. I'm trying to share something, but I'm always I have an eye on the chat box even as we're talking, because I can feel the exchange between us. And there's something very beautiful about that. Does everyone get it? Where it's kind of, on the one hand, we're not having a classical conversation. On the other hand, we can feel each other in the chat box. And when I see Angus, I feel Angus. I'm like, oh, here we are. So we can feel each other. And something very beautiful about that. I couldn't talk without feeling each other. So although I happen to be, it's my job to give the Dharmic talk, but we feel each other. There's this very unique and beautiful, we actually are a community. And I'm just, tears in my eyes. I'm so proud of who we are.